Hello and welcome to Wisdom Talks, the podcast accompanying the Metis Project, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices, to be found on www.metis.ethz.ch. Should wisely managed states be concerned with primarily the development of economic conditions, for example, with constantly increasing GDP? Does this automatically lead to better or even happier societies? In Bhutan, the Gross National Happiness Index was developed, which contrasts the globally widespread focus on GDP. It does not measure how much monetary value of goods and services a country has produced, but rather the extent to which the conditions for a happy life are in place, and therefore also where improvements need to be made. But can a state really want to create happy citizens? And are there not any negative connotations that come with this? Should the state not refrain from meddling in the lives of individuals? Do Western and Eastern ideals perhaps clash here? Michael Hampe, initiator of the Metis Project and professor of philosophy at ETH Zurich, and Dashokar Maura, president of the Center for Bhutan Studies and Gross National Happiness Research, discuss the state's role in people's happiness today. I hope our listeners will enjoy this conversation.
So thank you, Kamaua, for talking with us about the problems of power and wisdom. In 2010, you published a book with the title Leadership of the Wise Kings of Bhutan. And in that book, you wrote that your fourth king was very important for the development of your country because he was not only a great servant to your country, but he leaded the country from monarchy to democracy. And I guess that many of our hearers do not know that much about the history of Bhutan. Perhaps you can tell us as a start how this happened, how Bhutan changed from a monarchy to a democracy, and what role you played in this change.
Thank you very much for having me on your talk. The Kingdom of Bhutan in the recent past has full-fledged democracy. It was introduced in 2008 formally by declaration of a constitution, ushering in democracy. But the process of democratization as a practice started a bit earlier in 1980s, first by a decentralization of power to the local councils. Then gradually the local leaders of the 200 or so lowest level administrations were also subjected to secret ballot election. So the process has been gathering, but in 2002, the drafting committee of constitution was set up by the fourth king of Bhutan. And amongst many locally eminent people, insignificant individuals like myself were also included as a member of the drafting committee. And so it was enacted in 2008. In the same year, 2 years earlier, he abdicated the throne in favor of his son in order also to effect a change. So a new king would be starting a very fresh way of governing the country. I think in the global history, it is one of the more remarkable way of sort of conceding power to the people without a popular uprising or demand.
Usually you have a revolution and violence, and this was a peaceful shift from monarchy to democracy.
Yes, and nature, one of the important features of power is that it never concedes. And here, because of the wisdom of the king, as well as the culture of thinking, very much influenced by the ethics of Buddhism, I think they were able to reconcile this democratization.
In the West, we sometimes have the fantasy or the illusion of a wise kingdom that you find in Plato, for example, where the philosophers are supposed to rule. And you just said that there is a certain cultural background in the monarchy of Bhutan that might be a source for seeing power in a different way than it might be seen in Western societies. You refer to the Buddhist culture of your country. Can you say a little bit more about the relation between the Buddhist religion, politics, and, say, science? You are an economist also. You're not only an economist, you're a novelist, you're a painter. You serve in organizing your religion in your country. But the relation seems to me quite complicated between power, religion, and, say, scientific insight. Can you describe this relation in more detail?
Yeah, I think the Western political and moral theory sees the institutional arrangements as very important to control a negative side of power. And it protects the right and the freedom of the individuals from the aggressiveness of the state. So, it's essentially a claim against those who govern and the institutions who govern, which can potentially suppress and neglect freedom of the individuals. So that is very important, and that is very much confirmed in democracies, now also in Bhutan. But Buddhist ethics approached it from a slightly different angle, and that is, it did not specify anything very clear about the institutional structure of governance, nor of the institutions of civil society organizations very much. What it tried to take it as a very primary ontological question was the existence of things like aggressiveness, things like anger, which would produce fear in society, and thereby you could empty people's initiatives, thinking, rights, etc. And also it, along with anger and greed, which are seen as very primary force of society, which could be highly negative, it also postulated the inability of human beings to see reality in the sense of seeing as though you have a self, those kind of philosophical assumptions about perceptions and cognitions, mistake in the cognition, etc., were seen as fundamental. So Buddhism tried to take it on itself to elucidate problems of greed, problems of human anger and aggression and violence, and a mistaken belief in existence, independent existence of many things, including yourself. So I think there are important lessons to be taken from both theories, the Buddhist and the Western focus on rights and the separation between private and public. But it leaves those who are inside those institutions and organization still unaddressed, meaning it doesn't address the problem of the individuals suffering from this kind of afflictions. So there is still the potential for the institutions and the organizations to become unaccountable and immoral because they are occupied by individuals who are not necessarily virtuous. Now, the Buddhist one tries to illuminate that problem from the individual's psychology, cognition, mentality, etc. But it leaves the institutional side unaddressed.
I see.
So combined one would be very useful, in my opinion. And I think if there is a ideal possibility, that would be a useful hybrid. I mean, at the end, what I'm trying to say is the question of the virtue ethics needs to be brought into liberal political philosophy.
Yeah.
And the question of political philosophy needs to be brought into Buddhist.
Mm-hmm. But can I come back to the idea of non-self in, say, Buddhist anthropology or Buddhist psychology and its relation to democracy? Sometimes it's said that Western ideas about liberal democracies are motivated by a certain view of human beings, that there is a self that is to be protected from the grip of the state, and that this self is a source of happiness, of self-realization. And what you just told us about the Buddhist view is that there is no substantive self. There are emotions traveling through the human mind, say, and there are dangerous emotions and dangerous habits and good emotions, and anger and greed are dangerous emotions. But is there something in democracy that is important for the individual well-being from a Buddhist standpoint? Or does democracy have a different function in Bhutan? Would you say that than it has, say, in Germany or in Britain or in the United States?
I think the basic postulates about human rights, freedom, thought, freedom of speech, and the right to XYZ welfare, basic welfare, I think it's a very advanced and welcome everywhere. And it is compatible with Buddhist thought. Some of them are completely compatible with Buddhist thought, because in Buddhism also, finding evidence and then investigating to find empirical truth or fact is very basic point, because the Buddhism stress really that you have to find things from a first person point of view, then accept it. And that's about, the method is similar to science. As regards the right to life and the flourishing of human mind and body, that's also extremely compatible, because the person in Buddhism, as opposed to the self, is also constituted by body, feeling, perceptions, and consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
These features that constitute a person needs to be completely protected in order to flourish or advance towards wealth and happiness. Where it diverges a little bit, I think, is the assumptions about right to property, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Because now we have this extreme flowering of this right to property and inequality. And this is fully protected also by the legal singularity of an order which is protected by the government through its legislations. It leaves very little role for such things as compassion and generosity, which are basic features of Buddhist ethics of virtue. It's just the right to life and liberty, etc., has become little bit formal statements. They are undercut by the life to property. And the law, which is very much contractorian based, you can only fulfill some of these claims against each other if there is a contract, and there is no contract. So it's optional, And it also makes such things as generosity and compassion, seen from the Buddhist side, completely optional.
I see.
Liberal theory, therefore, in my view, cannot recommend or prescribe virtues in human beings, because these are private affairs.
Yeah. Perhaps we can come back to that later, because I think that's a very important point. But do I understand you right that you say on the level of the empirical person, say, there is not a great difference between understanding human life in Buddhist context and in a non-Buddhist context? The background metaphysics that there might be a substantial self or that there might be non-substantial self is not as important because you take the first-person perspective of the empirical self as important as people in the West take the first-person perspective as being very important for the political life. And the metaphysical background is not that important.
Okay.
Is that a right understanding of what you said?
Absolutely. The composition of a person with body, feelings, perceptions, consciousness is convergent.
Yeah. And I think we can discuss the problem of how to deal with virtuous ethics in context of the gross national happiness index you worked on and you introduced. It was introduced, if I'm informed rightly, in 2006 by the fourth king as well. And your research institute that is counseling your government is somehow looking after the fulfillment of improving the gross national happiness index in your country. And perhaps to make it clear for our listeners, you can describe what the gross national happiness index is, how it was introduced, and how you counsel your government that you get the right improvement in your country.
Yes, you mentioned 2006, but that is roughly the time when we started the index or the matrix for the gross national happiness. But as a conception and a philosophy of some kind, it existed much longer, since the 70s, when the fourth king of Bhutan came to the throne. So it was applied as an intuition to policies and legislations.
So you first had the intuition that policy should look after happiness of its people, but you couldn't measure it in the 1970s. Yes. And then you made it measurable, is that right?
That's absolutely right. And before that, they had the notions of priorities that needs to be attended in terms of, what you call departments and sectors in the government, that environment, culture, equitable regional development, sustainability would be priority areas in all planning and programming, and how the policies and legislation would be coherent with those thoughts placed through some sort of systematic discourse. And then as possibilities for surveys and statistics collection became likelier because of the technology, we developed survey-based indicators in 2006. And since then, we have had national surveys every 4 or 5 years once to update the data bank, and analysis, publications, reporting to the government to be incorporated into their planning and programming. So it is now both a discourse and a sort of statistics for management purpose in bureaucracy. So our office is responsible for surveying and analysis and publication on this, and submission to the government. The Prime Minister's office makes 5-year plans according to the benchmarks we propose to them.
Yeah. And you introduced this gross national happiness index as an alternative to the gross national product, the wealth that is produced in a country. And it seems that this first index is quite easily measurable. Your index seems to be not that easily measurable. If I'm informed rightly, you have 177 determinants of happiness which you try to monitor. Perhaps you can say a little bit more about what are the determinants and how you combine them if you get to a figure of the national happiness in Bhutan.
Yeah.
Looks complicated from the outside, what you have to do.
It looks for those who have no time, complex because it compresses lots of information into numbers. It tries to express social, cultural, environmental relationship into numbers. It is the nature of statistics, but actually the logic is quite simple. So it is really as simple as a calculation of GDP in some ways.
Can you describe it in more detail? So you ask the people, what is a determinant for your
Yeah.
happiness, and then they say health is a determinant, family is a determinant, income is a determinant, and
Yeah.
then you weigh these determinants in a certain
Yeah.
way.
The common sense loose definition of gross national happiness would be attainment of the conditions of happiness of the population. Attainment of the conditions. Now, the conditions are much broader than how happiness is conceptualized currently in the so-called subjective well-being approach. In the subjective well-being approach, as you know, a very simple question is asked, taking things overall, how do you judge your life, or how satisfied are you, 0 to 10?
Mm-hmm.
And then they try to also ask similar question on 0 to 10 scale on your health, income, work, and your family relationship. So it is a very simple construct. There are great benefits of this simple approach in terms of collection of data and reasonably cost economic way. But there are also problems, and chief among them is that the causal relationship between what you call satisfaction and variables are very limited. As you know, our life is influenced by much broader factors, broader context, both internal and external. And if you were to advance some policies, we need to know these broader conditions and causes. So, gross national happiness is a kind of a system of collecting statistics really to be applied also to government policy making. So, the broader framework for a perspective of happiness should accommodate these broader conditions. And these include really, first of all, things like the natural environment.
Mm-hmm.
Then we all live not alone or isolated, but at least in community with a network of friends, family, acquaintances. So the community is included. The culture by which we mean an entrenched habit amongst the population can bias the conditions towards happiness or lack of those conditions. For example,
that's where the virtues come in, probably the culture,
the virtue emphasis, as well as things like, is the society pro meditation or anti meditation? For example, it's a cultural matter.
Yeah.
So the culture is included. Often the government or the nature of the state is bracketed out from the causes of happiness. But you and I know that a government isn't like an atmosphere. It influences everything. So the relationship between the governance and the individual in terms of, protection of rights, freedom, jobs, this has to be discussed. So that is included. And somewhat a challenging concept on the influence of happiness is time, objective time, whether it is available for you for all the essential things you have to do for happiness, like socialization, good sleep, time for family, time for meditation, physical activity. So this is very, very important.
Yeah.
This is really not related to income.
I see. Yeah.
But not only objective time, but you see, half the time we are in subjective time. So, the quality of the time, the question of mind wandering. So we have to keep that also in focus. So time use is an important domain of cross-national happiness. Then, of course, things like health, education, so overall, and living standard, 9 areas. And we have indicators of 4 or 5 in each of these 9 domains, each in 9 domains. We have indicators, 33, spread over the 9 domains, and we check whether it is progressing or advancing every 4 or 5 years. What we learn, however, is that the tangible material aspects of the conditions of happiness are advancing very well in Bhutan. But we are learning, I think it is the first time learning in the world, that relational measurements of relationship in the community, between individuals, measurement of emotional fluctuations, frequencies of good and positive and negative emotions. When it comes to this kind of intangible things, we are not able to make rapid advancements like material sphere as doing material. So if you include in the gross national index all of these things, then there is a part which is moving fast, part which is hardly moving forward. But the hardly moving forward ones tend to be very important for happiness.
This seems to me to be a very inclusive and a broad view of happiness, where happiness depends on many conditions. And I wonder if at this point there might be a difference between conceptions of happiness that are related to Buddhist culture and, say, Western conceptions of happiness. In some philosophical context, it is said that the state can look after the security of the people. It can look after freedom, say freedom of speech, freedom of traveling. It can look after the material resources. And then the pursuit of happiness is a private business where the state should not be involved in. So in some conceptions of the West, a state that wants to make its citizens happy would be considered as being patronizing, say. You cannot know what makes me happy, and I cannot know what makes my neighbor happy, so happiness is a private thing, and the state should only bother about that there's clean water, clean air, that there's freedom of speech, and so on. So we sometimes separate happiness from other values, say like freedom or security or health. But you don't do that, it seems to me. And do you think that this idea of the West of happiness being a private goal that each individual can pursue, but that should not be pursued by the state, has something to do with the difference between Buddhist cultures and non-Buddhist cultures?
It might have to do with that, because the Buddhist culture takes it almost as axiomatic that suffering needs to be reduced. And the corollary of that is happiness needs to be
improved,
increased. But with the proviso that the concept and approach is very different from consequentialism or utilitarianism, where the aggregate is the sort of subject of the exercise. So it differs from that quite fundamentally. So then the potential damage and risk to the individual, because the state might sort of trade off minorities' happiness, majorities' goal and satisfaction. Those sort of things are ruled out in Buddhism because it's not consequentialist and utilitarian. Some authors have interpreted it in this way. I don't interpret it that way. So the ideal of life is to experience this state in mind. I think is probably a thing which is subscribed by all schools of Buddhism. Now, that has consequences thereafter on everything. I think that you take suffering and pain reduction as the principle or the basis of ethics. So, and naturally, it implies that all institutions and organizations have to pay attention to that. as I mentioned, since it doesn't define it in terms of consequentialism and Benthamite utilitarian type, this danger is not foreseen. This danger is born. In addition, it is combined with the process and the mechanism of the so-called six virtues, as you just alluded in Buddhism. The virtue that are to be practiced are generosity, compassion, patience, energy, tolerance, wisdom. So there is a concentration. There are six of them. And when this goal is approached through the sixth path, if it is applied in a disciplined way, there is no way, to become totalizing as we understand in the West.
Would you then say that Western societies, Western democratic societies, do not care enough about the suffering of its citizens, do not care enough about the virtuous structure of its citizens, and therefore runs into difficult policies? Do you think that policy of a state that cares more about suffering and virtues is better than one that does not care about it but leaves it to the private development of its citizens?
What is a prominent achievement of the modern Western society is its very enhanced notion of social justice. Because social justice in the Buddhist metaphysical moral theory is left to accountability of the individual in its multiple lives through the notion of karma, for example. Whereas the social justice is taken up as a upfront, this here and now issue in the West. So I think that is its major strength. I think that the notion that suffering can arise from multiple forms, including caused by yourself, is somewhat weak in Western literature, in my humble understanding. We began our discussion with the idea that some of this suffering can be caused by yourself, by the punishment of your own anger, for example, by the firing back of your own aggression, for example, or by misconception of reality with regard to the self, with regard to the lack of wider causes, dependent arising. That the nature of suffering can be sort of so subtle and unnoticeable, I think needed further elaboration, in my opinion, in the West. But of course, it is now in a globalized world well understood that a person's pain and suffering could arise from the lack of connections in the community, aloofness, psychological problems. Now, of course, our dependence on the environment not realized adequately, because we avoided, I think, the moral status of animals quite brutally. And its consequences is quite clear in terms of climate change, for example. Our conception of happiness and flourishing needs to be much wider. Otherwise, we will try to focus so narrowly on maximizing our individual comfort, happiness, and pleasures, while not thinking about the broader causes of it.
Could be that the environmental developments and the societal developments, as they are recognized in the West, lead to a change in conceptions of happiness, so that the idea that you can pursue happiness in private does not make much sense anymore if you see how much you are dependent on things that are not in your hands as a private person in order to be happy. So the dialogue between Buddhist cultures and non-Buddhist cultures might lead to a shift in conceptions of happiness in the West.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think the question of future multiple lives is important because that allows us to think about suffering in the future multiple lives. It is only now this future is apprehended and brought to the fore because of climate change. So the suffering of the future generation, which might be yourself, is a very important metaphysical way of thinking. I mean, it's not really a reasoned, causally based thinking, but it's a kind of thinking.
So you think that the Buddhist thinking is more caring about future lives than the Western conception of private pursuit of happiness in this life. So it's short-sighted. You would criticize this conception of happiness as a private business as being too short-sighted temporarily.
Yes, temporarily, I mean, sort of in its, I don't know whether it is, I think you can take it as a metaphor, imagery, but we have really no concept of future ourselves. We can't grasp it. We can't grasp it really. And only it presents to ourselves if we can grasp it as events or something like that, concrete, But if you project yourself, a conception of your own future, it is little more concrete to you. It's far less abstract. Apart from the question of logic and how consciousness continues into the future or not, for a common ordinary person, that there is some kind of future in a cosmic scale into the later on, did influence their behavior, I would say. Did influence their behavior. Whether it is scientific or not is a separate thing, but it did influence their actions and behavior. And we confirm this in our research. Those who believe in karma in Bhutan, and we make a joint distribution of those who believe that killing is justified, killing meaning mainly animals for food, lying is justified, stealing is justified, that sort of 5 refrains. We find that there's a huge difference between those who believe in karma and not believe in karma with respect to taking lives, mainly animals. So there we see some difference and that influence their behavior. This is the first time we see such statistical evidence.
I see. Can I come back to the question of virtues? To my view, virtues are developed in human beings during the educational and upbringing process. So the way your parents act, the way you are taught at school has certain consequences, and you develop certain virtues or you don't, depending on how you were brought up and what education you had. Now, how is the educational system organized in Bhutan? How much does the government, how much does the religion, how much are they involved in the organization of the educational system? And is the educational system focusing on certain virtues that might be good to develop in order to reach happiness? Or is that left to the parents, say? And is there a difference between upbringing at home and school training? What roles do schools play, and what roles does the government play in both parts of your upbringing, say?
Yeah. So the medieval period in Bhutan, because of the Buddhist influence on the necessity for enlightenment education, spent a lot of resource on monastic education. So that has been a long tradition of literacy. It is still is highly operational. So that is one line of institutionalization of Buddhist education. The second one is the modern education in the school, which has 100% enrollment done. And there is a mixture of Buddhist views in some subjects and completely pure Western education subjects in others. And of course, the most important one, as you mentioned, is really the education in the community, where children become social beings by being in the community. That, in my opinion, this third one is the most important one, because the monastic enrollment is relatively large relative to the population, but it's not universal. School is universal, but it lasts for a short time in your life. And there are too many subjects competing, sometimes contradictory, completely contradictory. Science will tell you one thing, Buddhist education will tell you another thing. So, but I think the community is education, in my opinion, is the most important one. Now, as regards happiness and GNH, some degree of it is taught in both. In the monastic, they do it through the teachings of Buddhism, where partly GNH also arises. In the school, some sort of enumerated versions of 9 domains and importance of this and that is taught. In the university, some people take it as a course. Business schools in Bhutan, it is also taught because there is a branch of GNH which is called business certification, how the business should be taking a view wider than mere profit.
And what role does the government play in these institutions? Does the government influence what is taught in the monasteries? Does the government prescribe what is taught in the schools? Does the government has any influence on the societal ways of upbringing?
Yeah. The monasteries are, in fact, to be very frank, even prior to the government. The institution of monastery is even prior to the government of United Bhutan, which was formed in 1626 out of many, many valley kingdoms. It was united. So, but the monasteries were there before that. So that is not much influenced by the government. They are on their own autonomous course as they have been in the past. The curriculum in the school is, of course, influenced by the Ministry of Education, which is a branch of the government. It approves the curriculum.
Is there a friction between the curriculum in the schools and the curriculum in the monasteries, or are they on one line?
No, they are. The worldview they adopt are different.
I see. And do you take that as an advantage or as a disadvantage?
I wish they were harmonized at some level, but I think this task is being left more and more to the individuals themselves as they grow old, what view they take. But it is a melange, or is a very plural just now.
I see.
So that is why in our society too, there is a lot of competition of ideas. Some people advocate GNH, some Buddhist view, some absolutely Western view, So there is a huge plurality at this moment.
So one very last question, if you have the time. You yourself, you were educated both in Bhutan and in Oxford, in the West. What consequences did this have to your own mind, you would say, of diving deeply both into a Buddhist educational system, coming from a Buddhist society, and then having an academic career, say, in one of the top universities of the West?
Yeah, I'm very privileged to have this mixture in my life. I think it's thoroughly enriching to see all sort of ways of the world. But my mind is taken increasing towards the future as we grow old. We face mortality, but that is not the end. There are successions of people, beings, and the question of climate change is a very fundamental one in our life. And I wish only from this point of view that both people in Bhutan and the leaders and outside take some of the Buddhist views more seriously and apply it to policies and the running of the government, some of it. And the question of social justice for people who are depressed, suicidal, drunk, lonely, and poor. This needs to be minimum thing they have to address. But beyond that, I think the runaway materialism of the world is very costly and catastrophic, in my opinion. And we have to kill less animals, We have to do with far less materials if we have to increase chances of well-being for all. So from that point of view, I'm privileged again to take the lessons of teachings of Buddhism. But I'm extremely impressed with the technology and the science of the West, very impressed. So, but overall, I mean to say that the extraction at this rate of 92 billion tons per year, etc., so much emissions. Emissions are just merely another way of saying that we are passing the cost to someone else for our well-being and happiness. This worries me a little bit, and we need to combine all kind of perspective. And GNH, in a very tiny way, tries to combine this. See how successful it is in a very tiny, insignificant way in the world.
Well, I don't think it's that tiny. Many more countries than Bhutan try to pick it up, I believe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for all the insights you gave us, Karma.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
We have now reached the end of today's Wisdom Talk. Many thanks to Dasho Karma Ura and Michael Hampe. Thank you also to our listeners. At this point, we would like to also invite you to follow further Wisdom Talks, as well as to curiously plunge into the multitude of texts and other podcasts that can be found on our website, www.metis.ethz.ch, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom, literature, and wisdom practices. You can also find more information in the show notes below. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye. This Metis Wisdom Talk was produced by Martin Münich and supported by ETH Zürich and Udo Keller Stiftung Forum Humanum in Hamburg.